Even in a week when there's like 3 different deck builders coming out, Nowhere Prophet still manages to stand out. It takes a lot of cues from more traditional trading card games and repurposes them with a roguelike spin. It's got a pretty unique art style that smashes Mad Max Wastelander chic with Indian cultural theming, and it's attempting to build a more narrative-centric game revolving around your connection with your followers. And the result is a game that's most easily described as a deck builder, but feels in execution more like if somebody made Hearthstone or Magic into a roguelike. And if you ask me, that sounds pretty heckin' cool and unique. As always, I'm Alex, and this is First 5, where I ask if games are worth your time, not your money. I played a game for 5 hours, and I'm gonna tell you if those were 5 hours well spent. And today, our convoy strikes out across the wasteland in Nowhere Prophet. Before we get too deep into the review, I did receive a free advance review copy for this game, so a big thank you to Shark Bomb Studios and No More Robots, and a heads up for everybody else. But right from the start, Nowhere Prophet differentiates itself from other deck builders. A lot of games in this field, especially the most popular ones, feel like RPGs, where you're slowly sharpening your initial character into a single, finely honed tool, and each turn is a poker hand you try to build combos out of. But Nowhere Prophet feels more like a single-player arena run of Hearthstone, played out over an hour or 2 long roguelike. That might sound like I'm splitting hairs a little, but let me explain. Starting with the deck building itself. You start with not 1, but 2 decks. The first is your leader deck, which represents the personal capabilities of your character themselves. This deck is the one that hews closer to the traditional deck builder formula, where you're trying to sculpt a small, synergistic deck. But those familiar with traditional TCGs will recognize it as a collection of instant abilities that's been separated out from the rest of your deck like oil from water. Cards that go into the leader deck are permanently stuck there, but every time you level up, you can choose to get rid of one forever. The other deck represents your convoy, TCG minions that come with a set amount of damage they do, a persistent health pool, and a load of familiar abilities like charge and taunt. And unlike your leader deck, you can swap characters in and out of your convoy deck at will and create exactly the build you want. Once a fight actually starts, those minions do most of the heavy lifting. You might be able to help them along by buffing an ally here or stopping an enemy there, but who wins the day largely comes down to board control, and your primary way of crushing your opponent is getting your minions to smash their face in. And the longer the fight goes on, the bigger the cards you can start dropping to accomplish just that. That's all to say, it's Hearthstone, guys. It's single-player Hearthstone with a slightly more complicated board. You even have a mana curve tracker and everything. And in my opinion, it works. Every once in a while, my AI opponents would do something truly baffling, like hitting a harmless rock instead of my face, but because things like your health track through multiple battles, it doesn't need to be the sharpest opponent to still be threatening. If I'm being honest, I think the game also leans a little too heavily on the base kits you start with, and wish I could make my decks feel a little more unique each run, but the way you slowly discover its pool of cards by finding them in the wild one at a time still makes for some genuinely entertaining mechanical exploration and deck construction. Then you throw in equipment that you can either wear for small synergistic buffs or scrap for more cards, and a roguelike metagame that sees you trying to balance food, faith, and funding while traveling on an FTL-style map filled with random events and hotspots to drift towards. The result is that you're kind of playing a more traditional TCG draft, except your drafted cards are rewards for winning fights, pickups from random events, or purchased on the market. But Nowhere Prophet isn't quite done with its twists yet. Severely complicating your life is the injury system. While in other games it might be easy to just trade cards with your opponent and bully them into submission, that's not the case here. See, every single card you play represents one of your actual physical followers, and if they die in the game, they die in real life. Any card that gets knocked to 0 HP on the board picks up an injury, and if a card picks up 2 injuries, it's permadead, and you never get to use it again. On the mechanical side, this significantly affects how you play. Running counter to how almost any other card game works, trading becomes your last resort. Often, I would use my many leader cards to provide supporting fire over forcing my underlings into direct deadly combat, and the shorter I could make a fight, the more relieved I would be. You always have to be focused on the long term, and so you don't want to get caught in a slugfest that injures half your deck right before an important boss fight and leaves you vulnerable until you can heal them again. There's also a lot to be said about how well this system puts you into the mindset of the character you're playing, a religious leader in an extremely dangerous post-apocalyptic wasteland. Combat and death is inevitable, often even necessary, but you still want to protect and shield as many of your flock as you can. Because your cards have mechanical value, there's also the verisimilitude of emotional value, even though your underlings rarely ever so much as speak, much less have any characterization of their own. But while it's admirable that Nowhere Prophet so cleanly puts you into the role-playing headspace of your character, there's unfortunately not much there to actually roleplay with. Nowhere Prophet has a pretty solid call to adventure, with you following the crash of a satellite, which in this post-apocalyptic world is basically a creature of almost biblical proportions, and hearing its quote-unquote dying words as it bids you strike out for a vault across the wasteland. But nothing after that ever really piqued my interest. The game has major hubs you can explore in your adventures across the wasteland, but they only seem to have a few static events each, and most of the few that do exist are locked behind strict requirements and don't seem to amount to much. And when you're traveling between cities, 70% of the events you'll run into are variations on, "they shot at us, so we're fighting now." In this case, Nowhere Prophet also emulates FTL in less flattering ways, where there's clearly a world out there to explore, complete with multiple unique cultures, but it's all elusive and rarely amounts to anything more than a general vibe. The one thing that does make the world come alive, however, is the art. Card illustrations, event key art, and settlement splash screens alike all look phenomenal, and it's one of the game's high points. But with all that laid out, it's time to get to the important question. What do you get out of 5 hours with Nowhere Prophet? A truly dire run will end ignominiously in about 30 minutes, but to make it to the end, you're looking at a roughly 2.5-ish hour run. But that's far from a guarantee that you'll make it to the end of Nowhere Prophet in just 5 hours. I certainly didn't, though I came close once. As a roguelike, this is a game meant to be played over and over, which means you can more or less play as much or as little as you care to and still enjoy it. There is one point against Nowhere Prophet for the time concerned, however, and that's the rate of unlocks. There are a good half-dozen starting convoy deck archetypes to unlock, with 3 extra leader decks on top, but by the end of my 5 hours, I'd only unlocked 1 of each. It's not exactly a bad thing per se, but it's worth noting that unlocking new things in this game is a moderately slow process. And if you only play the game for a few hours, you're never going to see everything it has to offer. But luckily, this is a game that's entertaining from its first few minutes, even with the basic starting equipment it gives you. Nowhere Prophet was a joy to play. If all you've ever played is something like Slay the Spire or some of the more common tabletop deck builders, this probably isn't going to be exactly what you'd expect from this very specific genre, but I still feel like it's worth checking out. Hey, if you're looking for more fun, short games to dig into, then check out last week's quarterly wrap-up for a whole heaping pile of them. But if you're specifically looking for more roguelike action, the recent Cadence of Hyrule has got you covered. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this first 5 review. If you did, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button. If you're looking for games that value your time and don't pad themselves, I'm your guy. Thanks for watching this far, and I'll see you all next week.